the difficult stuff starts. Actually, the Rambam there starts off and he says, if someone wants to know, if you want to know, then, if someone's heart desires to know, somebody says,
I just read that first paragraph.
so that's chapter 11. Today, chapter 10 is still a little easier. Okay, so solar year, the person who says it's it's a little bit less than a quarter. So he says it's 365 days, 5 hours, 997 chalakim, and this is today's chapter 10, right? Let me just double check. What he does is, and just make sure, to the actual calculation that the Beis Din did in the times of the Beis Hamikdash, even though it was established by witnesses, they had to do the calculation in order to establish the witnesses. So, so the Rambam says that there's debates on all these calculations, and there's mistakes and things like that, and therefore he's going to clarify the proper way of calculating it once and for all, so people will not make the mistakes. And then also he says, according to a lot of calculations and checking, there are some sages who still know this, and there are also things which are passed down. And he says, therefore, because there's confusion, I'm going to set the record straight. And he says another interesting thing. He says maybe you'll think that there's more details which aren't clear, and you'll have to go. And he said you can be more precise and there are more details, but they aren't necessary in our calculation. And he's basically putting it in here to clarify it, because without the Rambam, you'd have to look at different math, use different mathematical models and everything like that, and you ultimately would not calculate the same thing that they have in the olden days. You might be off. Okay, so here's what he says. The average amount of sun movement every day, every 24 hours, is 50. The sun's movement on one day is 24 hours, 59 chalakim, and 8 shniyos. Comes out 10 days, it goes 9 degrees. Okay, so obviously, and in 10 days, it goes 9 degrees and 51 chalakim and 23 shniyos. Comes out in 100 days, it goes 98 degrees. So now, 98 degrees, 33 chalakim, and 53 shniyos. Comes out that in 1,000 days, after you take out all the 365 degrees, as we explained before, and 265 degrees for the rest over, you'll have this amount of time. So here's how the Rambam's model works, and it's important to remember. So the Rambam describes earlier that the universe is kind of like an onion, and you have different layers of space.
Spheres.
And those spheres all have their own movement. The actual space has its own movement. So now, what we call sunrise is basically the sun's sphere. The sphere that the sun is in goes around once every day. That is what we call sunrise. But the sun is also traveling. The sun is also traveling in its own sphere. So every year, right? So that's what creates a year, right? So in modern science, what the equivalent to the world spinning on its axis is actually the space moving instead of the world moving. That's the space moving. So for practical purposes, we don't need to call that really the movement of the sun. That's what creates a day. But what we call a year is a sun has traveled around the whole earth one full time. That's what a year is, right? So now, each day we're lucky that 360 degrees is a circle, and each year is 365. So every 24 hours, it's approximately 1 degree, right? So now, in modern science, just to translate it, but we got to really let go of that. In modern science, right, the Earth travels 1 degree around the sun. right? In geocentrism. But in heliocentrism, the sun travels 1 degree. So now when the sun, that means when the sun, after 24 hours, when the sun has gone around the world a full time, it's going to be a degree further than it was the day before on its own track.
But this is the Earth.
Yeah.
This is the sphere the sun is from.
Correct.
So
the sun is actually moving in its own time space, and its sphere is moving on its own time space. So like it's almost like imagine the sun was in a car, right? Imagine you had the object in the car. So besides the fact the car is driving around, right? The sun is also moving. So each day it ends up in 24 hours, it ends up at a different place than it was the day before.
But the sun is in this model.
Yeah.
I'm not debating the model.
Yeah.
Just the sun travels around the Earth once every day, right?
Yes, but we don't call that the sun travel. We call that the sphere travel, the space travel. So that's why I'm trying to clarify. So 24 hours, so it's like there's two movements going on. One movement, the daily travel of the sun, it's actually interesting to ponder. The sun doesn't even feel it. Because if the sun had a personality, which the Rambam actually says the sun does, but if the sun doesn't feel that movement because its whole space is moving. Like when you go into a spaceship, according to the Rambam's model, and you see the Earth spinning, really the space that you're in is spinning. You don't feel that model because you are stuck in your space. So there's basically the spherical movement, and then there's a sun movement, and that's something that I just remember the first time I hammered through this like properly. I had to like really think about it a lot because like when the Rambam here, when he's talking about the sun going 365 days, it's a whole time, a whole revolution. The Rambam's talking about the sun's movement, not the daily movement.
I'm still trying to understand what a day is in this model. So is he talking about the rotation of the sun on its own axis?
Yes, there's two things. So here's what
does that cause night and day of the sun?
No, that causes seasons. That causes a year.
So my understanding, I'm sorry, but
yeah.
I'm operating from English because I haven't done my deep dive on geocentrism yet. But if I thought the idea of the sphere, the onion, is that it is a physical entity in this model. Right?
Yeah.
And the sun is embedded in that sphere, right?
Correct.
So when we see the sun move, it's the sphere turning, right?
That's the daily movement.
That's the daily movement.
Yeah.
So the sphere and in the middle of that sphere is the Earth, right?
Correct.
Right? So the sphere turns once, that's a day.
Yeah.
So
now the sun itself is also moving. The sun is also moving, right? So in addition,
it's moving along the sphere?
Yeah, at a very slow pace. That pace to get around takes a year. That's what a year is.
So the sun isn't embedded in the sphere. It's traveling along the sphere.
Well, so here's the thing. It is embedded in the sphere because the space of the sphere is moving, just like us, right?
It's on a track then.
It's on its own track, right?
On the sphere.
Yeah. So imagine it's like you're in an airplane, right? You're embedded in the airplane. You can't get out of the airplane, right, but you can move around in the airplane, right? So and the same thing would be with us. See, when we look at this model, so let's say the Earth is spinning scientifically on its own axis.
Correct.
We don't feel it very easily, but it's spinning actually very fast.
1 day. It's 20. The Earth is. Go ahead.
Yes, correct. It's spinning very fast. We don't feel it. So we're embedded in that system of movement, but we can also have our own movement, right? So now let's say you'll look up at the stars at night, right? Or let's say you'll travel. Your environment is moving very fast, but the travel you feel, that's your own personal travel. So the same thing with the sun. What creates a day is one movement of the sphere the sun is in. But what the sun is also on its own orbit. It has its own movement, and that's what creates a year. And that's why sometimes the sun will be further from Earth, and sometimes it'll be closer from Earth.
Okay.
So that's how he's saying that here. Okay.
Okay. I actually didn't really understand.
Yeah. So that's something which, you know, it's so in, let's say, the equivalent in modern science. So if you're gonna, as I said before, I said like scientifically, if you want to translate everything, it's just shifting different math to different movements. In other words, like if everything's relative, right? So if you say, hey, this moves this fast, and then it turns out this isn't moving, well, then that means space is moving this fast, right? So it's important to remember those two things. People a lot of times get confused with that. So in other words, the space, so the equivalence is the space, what we call geocentrism, what it calls a year, is the Earth went around the sun a full time, right? However, the Earth is also spinning on its axis. So the Rambam's saying, instead of saying the Earth's spinning on its axis, say space is spinning one day, where the sun is one time a day, one revolution a day. And instead of saying the Earth is moving around the sun, say the sun's moving around the Earth. So there's two movements going on. So, as we'll say actually, we'll say that when you're looking at the sun, and this is actually, kind of amazing how the Rambam knew this, but when you're looking at the sun, relative to the Earth, he's going to say one time is a year, and it gets exactly the place it was the year before. However, when you really look at it, it's slightly off, because the orbit of the sun changes slightly every year, and that's what every 28 years the orbit is in the exact same place as it was at the beginning of creation. So that's why we make that special blessing. Okay, so let's go a little bit more here. I'm not going to be able to get too far in this because you'll see it's going to... Okay, so it comes out.
I have to do some reading.
Yeah, it comes out. Okay, so now the Rambam goes through 10,000 days, and he's trying to show how you can know. Basically, the Rambam is not just, he's kind of rubbing in all the details. So you can calculate any amount of days based on, a full year is this amount, 10 years is this amount, et cetera, and then you just need to add a little bit for the she'eris, for the extra of each year. Now, I'll just tell you, I remember there was the guy who actually I studied with the first time. I don't remember what grade I was in, but his name was... Now, there's a lot of great models, graphic models online now, where they show, and there's even a guy in Crown Heights, he has managed like a big beach ball with all the planets on it, and the Earth in the middle, and he can show how each of these things is, spinning. And there's a lot of graphic models. So the guy who was doing this, this is years before all the graphics, but he was actually a theoretical physicist who lives in LA. Ironically, he's a Chabad rabbi. Ironically, his last name is Einstein, but they call him Einstein, and he had triplets who were in the yeshiva, 2 or 3 sons who were in yeshiva with me, good friends of mine, and he would come every year and teach this, and for profession, he's a PhD, but for profession, he's an actuary for the Miami Heat. That's what he does for his profession, but he would come and teach us every year, and he would, at that time, nowadays, I can whip up a video probably, in a couple hours.
I saw a couple of them. Ptolemy's.
Yeah, but then what he had was a program he had basically a program where you're looking at the sky and you could see where the sun was on any given day, and you could see how the sun moves slightly throughout the year and everything like that. That's what he used. But he basically, when he studied this, it just took a long time to not to confuse those two movements.
Yeah, it is, because it's fundamentally different from the two movements in our, in the geocentric, in the heliocentric. One is the Earth moving on its axis that gives us a day, and then the Earth moving around the sun gives us the year. But here, you're assuming this Earth is stationary, right?
Yeah, according to the Rambam here, yeah.
Yeah. No, I'm not...
Because the reason why I'm saying that, because in Judaism, tradition, there's different opinions if the Earth is stationary or not. But everyone agrees it's geocentric. So that's according to but the Rambam's method here. So like the hardest thing to wrap my mind around was movement of space. We take for granted that, we just think, oh, atmosphere is nothing, it's nothing. And we're not talking about a wind, we're not talking about a wind. We're talking about actual movement.
Yeah, because there's two movements that give us the day and the year in the heliocentric system. In the geocentric system, those two movements have to both involve the sun.
Yeah.
And that's hard. That is hard to wrap your mind around. How you perceive a day, not how you perceive a day, but how you account for the day, how you account for the movement of the sun in a day.
Yes, correct.
If it's moving around the earth, because that's a lot of movement for one day.
Yes, correct. So,
I mean, even in the geocentric model, the sun is still far away, so it has a long way to go.
Correct. But we're also, correct. It's true, but it's a different type of movement. That's the idea you have to wrap your mind around. It's like technically the sun is moving in the heliocentric model. Technically, the Earth is moving very, very fast. So it's a different type of movement. So that's what that like. And if you're looking, you zoom out and you look from God's perspective, it's like He has these small planets moving around. For Him they're not big. The movement for Him is like, that's just the way He created it. So
I'm gonna have to read up on that.
Yeah. Okay. So now what the Rambam is going to go into. So a month we said is 29 days. So that means the sun, right? The sun goes 30 degrees in that amount of time roughly, right? So now.
Are we in 12?
Yeah, we're in 12. I'm in the first law. I'm in the first law, but I'm in like the several paragraphs in.
Okay.
So now, the sun, the moon always has light on it from the sun. The question is if the light is on Earth's side or on the opposite side of the moon, right?
So what's the theory of the movement of the moon?
So the moon has its own orbit that we'll get to soon.
But it's also orbiting around
the Earth.
The Earth.
Yeah. The moon has its own orbit. It actually has two orbits, but
it has its own sphere.
It has its own, yeah. So, but right now, that basically what the Rambam does is he starts off with a very simple moon thing, and then he keeps adding other details to the moon's movement and tweaks the original calculations. That's what he does. And he makes like a more simplified calculation, and then says, well, that's going to be off because X, Y, Z. And then he doesn't actually give all of the reasons why. He doesn't go into the math, but he says, in order to fix where the moon's going to be, because the moon is on its own orbit and because its own orbit is elliptical, we're going to add this. We're going to tweak this mathematical calculation and add this into the formula.
So in this model, the orbits are elliptical or circular?
Elliptical, and right now they're circular. In other words, the Rambam basically what he does is he starts with what's called the Mahalach Emtsai, which is average, which means circular, and then he says, okay, because it's elliptical, that means this is going to change. So so in the end, what the Rambam is going to have is like this big formula. If you want to know where the moon is, first you calculate it average, and then you tweak the numbers this percent because it's elliptical, and then you tweak that number because the moon is on its own orbit, and then because the moon is elliptical, and then at the end he says, and this is exactly where the moon's going to be on any given day. That's how the Rambam does it. Okay, so he says you should know. So the sun average goes 29 days, in 30 days, it goes this amount. And if it was all equal, then we could predict exactly where the moon is based on the sun's movement. So you have the sun's one second. Okay, so you have the, basically every 30 days we can predict where the moon's going to be, thereby predict where the sun's going to be. right? Sorry, protect where the sun's going to be, and therefore, if everything was average, we would know every 30 days you'll have a new moon, right? Because we know where the sun's going to be. Then, okay, number 2, the Rambam says, and we'll do a little bit more, just because I can't do a half job. In other words, like either we got to take out the paper and pens and start calculating and drawing diagrams.
I get it.
So the Rambam now introduced what's called the Goiva Hashemesh. Now, there's a third movement of the sun. Okay, so the sun's atmosphere is moving around once a day, and then the sun itself has its own movement every year, and it's elliptical, right? And the Earth is not in the center either, right? The Earth is not in the center. The furthest point that the sun is from the Earth, the Rambam calls the Goiva Hashemesh, the height of the sun. That's the furthest point. Now, the Goiva Hashemesh also is on a movement. That also moves.
So the ellipse is rotating.
The ellipse is rotating. And that, every 70 years, it moves 1 degree.
Wow.
Yeah. Okay, so now, how much does it move in 10 days? This is 1 second and a half. And we said a second is like a millisecond, and which is a third of a third. Comes out. 100 days is 15 seconds. Again, a shniya, I don't remember exactly what it is, but it's a very, very a small amount of time. And 1,000 days is going to be 2 chalakim, about 4 seconds, 4 degrees, 4 seconds, which is a thousandth of a degree or something like that. And 1,000 is going to be 15 chalakim. And comes out that every 29 days is 4 shniyos. Okay. So, so the Rambam says in chapter 11, he says, we already said that the beginning of our calculation is going to be a Tuesday night. This is a Thursday night, which is the 3rd day of Nisan of the year the year 4,938 years of creation. That's where the Rambam is located. So he says basically we're going to calculate, that's the time that he's giving. The time that he's giving is Thursday night, the 3rd day of Nisan. The 3rd day of Nisan, 4,938 years to creation. And the average movement of the sun is at 7 degrees and 3 chalakim. And the Goiva Shemesh, the furthest distance of the sun's orbit at that time is going to be 26 degrees, 45 chalakim, 8 shniyos, and it's in Ta'imim. Ta'imim is twins. That's one of the zodiac astrology signs in the sky, one of the constellations.
Okay, I found where you are.
All right. So when you want to know where the sun is on the average movement anytime, you take how many days from this date, and then you take the average movement at that time, based on what we said, how to calculate from that time, and you add that all on that time, and that will be where the average movement of the sun will be on that day. Okay, I'm going to stop here, but the Rambam luckily actually does spell it out, and he does. I think what's cool about the Rambam is he kind of makes a really working model where he goes through examples and this and that. So if you become an expert in this, everything kind of becomes obvious, But it is a lot of math.
And it works.
And so, the first time I learned this, I remember I got really lost at, there are certain points where you say, oh, I got this. And then the Rambam says, wait, this isn't really centered, and this is moving. So, yeah.
What I read, I just have I haven't studied this. So, on the basis of predictions, the geocentric model predicts as well as you can't distinguish between heliocentricity and geocentricity on the basis of predictions.
Correct.
Or observations.
The math is the same.
Because the math is the same.
Yeah.
So what I was searching for, the thing that got sidetracked was, is there any scientific
Proof. Yeah.
proof that establishes the heliocentric system?
Yeah.
And I can't find it.
So the only after I talked to him, I kind of thought about it. I said, wait, it doesn't. He said you can measure inertia of the Earth's movement, the inertia. But then, if you're talking about space moving and space being matter, then the inertia is in the space. So I said, hey, whatever movement you're going to have here, if you shift it to something another object, then. I mean,
and all movement is relative to where you're standing.
So when the Rebbe, I don't know the details, and I never really got into it because you have to read a lot of books. But when Herman Bronifer, the Rebbe wanted him to write up an article about it, and he wrote a long article, and the Rebbe kind of said to him, no, you're overcomplicating it. He said it's just in the basic relativity theory, and then he said, oh yeah, you're right, I didn't think about that. And then, so I don't know fully, but it is a really, really the most open-minded. So let's say the physicist that I always talk about in Chicago, he would say, scientifically, you can't prove either way. Don't say, he would say, in other words, if someone would say, I can prove it scientifically, he would say, no, stop, pushing science out of context here. We're trying to, that's what he would say. So I think, it's a good discussion. It's good to open our minds to things. The Rebbe was very, in Mind Over Matter, the Rebbe wrote extensively about evolution and stuff like that. And what the general gist of what he would say stop saying science has absolutes. There's just a probability, and when you're talking about God and the Torah, there's not really probability. In other words, when you're looking at the Torah, God says, I did it this way, And science is saying, based on our tools, this is how it would need to be done. So there's the main scientist that the Rebbe wrote to Mind Over Matter, there's a book of his sayings. So he says, he has little sayings, he was in the Museum of Natural History and Science, and they were building a dinosaur model. And he said, hey, why are you making it green? So the paleontologist said, because dinosaurs are green. He says, I don't know, maybe they're pink, How do you know they're green? And he's good question,
They're just projecting.
So he said basically that a lot of people, he said Lubavitchers would always come to me and say, hey, speak to the scientists here, prove them that the universe is geocentric, or prove him that, and he would say, no, that's not what the Rebbe meant. The Rebbe wasn't trying to prove things scientifically. He was just trying to open the possibilities in science of the Torah's belief. In other words, open the possibilities, because the possibilities are open in science. A true scientist should, and actually it's really interesting, Einstein, there's this famous scientist named Velikovsky, you may have heard of him. So he wrote a book called Ages in Chaos, which is about the 10 plagues. And he had all these different theories, and some of his 10 plague theories are wrong Torah-wise, But he wrote a bunch of different theories, and he wrote to Einstein, and Einstein told him, he said, hey, I know you could be right, and you know you could be right. He said, but don't share this in the public, you're going to just get beaten down if you...
I think in my late teens or early 20s, I read a book by Velikovsky. I don't remember which one it was, though.
Well, so he has theories of gravity and different theories, which he's just opening his mind to it. So Einstein has a letter, he says, I know you could be right, and you know you could be right. But don't share this stuff in public.
The thing of it is, heliocentric system has become the conventional wisdom.
Correct, totally.
So why?
Correct.
That's the question.
That's the big question.
Why?
Now, I want to tell you, even when I was studying the Rambam the first time, so this guy, Professor Einstein, he kept saying, well, so in Torah, it's possible the earth is spinning, or it's possible the earth is stationary. In the Torah's perspective, that's debated. So he kept saying, well, if you say the Earth is stationary, then this, and if you say the Earth is not stationary, then you calculate it on this. And I had a really hard time. For me, it was hard because, I'd been to the museum and seen the pendulum, they have and it was hard for me to open my mind to that. So I would say, okay, I'm just going to calculate it as if the Earth is moving on its axis. But then eventually I opened my mind to it. It's like humbling, it's like, well, so.
Didn't the Bible say that it's not?
But geocentricity, the question, we learned this in an earlier volume. Geocentricity is halacha. Right?
So the Rebbe says, basically in geocentricity, when it comes to the Earth spinning on its axis, the Rebbe says, the Rambam doesn't conclude, this is the models he's using. But when it comes to geocentricity, he says the Rambam is saying this. Now, it might just be his observation, but the Zohar says that it's in the center. So the Rambam must be...
Of the universe?
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
The solar system?
Well, that's another discussion. That's another how we define the universe. But the Rambam seems to say it's in the beginning in the center of the solar system. So the Rebbe says, because the Rambam is talking like the Zohar. He's speaking like the Zohar. Then, in those places, the Rebbe really is like, hey, this shouldn't be such a big deal, The only thing that would bother the Rebbe is when people say, science has proven something against the Torah. And he would say, no, wait 1 second.
Right. No one wants to do that. But
So he would say, for Torah's integrity, I have to show that science has not disproven the Torah's. So, really, I just want to say, it shouldn't trigger anybody. Really, as scientists, we're not scientists, but as big scientists, it shouldn't trigger us to think either way. In other words, we should be it could be that way, it could be that way, and, it could be there's factors we're not worried about. Even gravity, the Rebbe he said, gravity is accepted fact nowadays. But real scientists know it's not accepted fact. It's a potential theory to answer a bunch of questions. And he said, I would hope that, over time we'll ask more questions and we'll perfect our theories and maybe come with different theories. And as our knowledge of the universe expands, we'll be able to.
yeah, in teaching statistics, base the whole thing on the scientific method. And the scientific method rests on formulating hypotheses and testing them. And in that framework, you never prove anything is true.
Correct.
Because you only have evidence for or against.
Well, also in addition to that, when you're going to have evidence for or against, it is going to be your choice to follow that formula, which is in other words.
But even in that case, it's sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
but Stephen, in that case, it's not absolute.
Correct.
It's probabilistic.
Correct.
It's likelihood. It's the fancy word for it is stochastic. And this is what I try to teach the students, that you never prove anything to be true. You can't, that's outside the realm of science, because science only deals in testing hypotheses. And it's so.
Well, and also,
but some theories are so well supported that we do say.
Well, so sometimes people have a hard time. You have sometimes scientists say, yes, there's 1 in a billion chance God created the universe. Let's say, right? But that formulation of calculation, which creates that probability, is based on other probabilities and other calculations and other calculations. So it's when we say there's 1 in a million chance, that's all in our scope. But if we broaden our scope, it might be 1 in a million chance the opposite. Right. In other words, we created a system. So,
and that's not even talking about the assumptions that underlie the model.
Yeah. So
I'm with you on all of that.
So I remember I was arguing with someone who's a scientist, and I said, gravity's a theory. We don't know it absolutely. He said, jump off a roof. And I said, I don't want to jump off a roof. He said, why not? I said, because I'll fall. He said, so you do believe in gravity? I said, no, falling when you jump off the roof has nothing to do with my belief or non-belief in gravity. In other words, you don't have to know the word gravity or know anything about that to be programmed that when you jump off a roof, you're going to fall. In fact, it works the opposite way. We know we're going to fall, and so we're trying to figure out why we're going to fall, and then the theories come. So, yeah, I don't,
I'm with you.
there are people who created programs with the Rambam, and I remember with the year of Birchas Hachama where they blessed the sun. Now, there were everyone made videos to show at your program when you go bless the sun, so people understand what's happening, and someone made heliocentric versions, and a lot of people called it out, and they said, there's no reason from a Jewish perspective to feel you need to do that. Like, I understand more people will accept but really it's like, for the context of making a bracha on the sun, you could just follow the Rambam's model. It is, you don't have to change it. In other words, it doesn't have to be, so that's what Einstein tells Velikovsky in this letter. He says, you and I can talk creative thinking like that, but he said, don't go in the public with that. They'll knock you down. You'll be considered a outcast.
Yeah, this is a tough one because there's no observational difference between the two models, and so on what basis are you going to choose the model that you think actually reflects reality? You got to have some basis for preferring one over the other. So if observational results don't produce different results, which apparently they do not, then on what basis are you going to accept one model and reject the other?
Correct.
But nonetheless, the heliocentric model is the conventional wisdom.
Totally.
So why? That's the thing. But anyway, I have a lot of reading to do. I've just started. I've never studied this stuff before. So, and everything, as a kid growing up in the United States in the 20th century, you learn that the sun is at the center of the solar system, period.
Correct.
And that's an article of faith. And then when you come up against this, you're like, wait a minute, what the heck are you talking about?
I actually was the opposite. When I was a kid and I learned the universe is heliocentric, the solar system is heliocentric, I always hated science and history in school because it never would break down the discussions further.
Never matter. It would never matter.
One second, it would never break down the discussions further than fact accepted. It would never break it down further. And therefore, I simply detested reading anything about science or anything about history when I was in school, in grade school, because it never, it would always just say like, okay, this is communism, this is that, and it's like actually when you live, we live in America now, and you look at how many people want socialism and how many people want capitalism, you see that there's a lot deeper than saying this is the way it was, this is bad, this is good. You see there's things about humanity and humans that you have to, and the same with science. So I always hated, I didn't like a lot of things in physics because it was just, and math as well. Like math, I felt that after school, suddenly when you start thinking about trigonometry, all these rules make sense. They're all, but there it's like rule number one, you have to memorize. So one thing on social media they always show is average person doesn't know the order of operations.
What's operation?
Math. Average person. And they make fun of that. But I know why they don't know the order of operations. Because in school they teach you PEMDAS is the order of operations. But they don't teach you why. And really if you're doing math, you can create, if you're writing the formula, you can create your own order of operations. And someone decided that this was the order of operation, and maybe he had reason to do that, but it wasn't fully necessary to establish it. In other words, I could say, here's my math problem, and you could say, this is the answer, because order of operation. I could say, no, you're wrong. I don't follow the conventional order of operations. And so I researched once, what is the reason for the order of operations? And I read it, and I said, well, okay, those are convenient reasons, but you can also formulate convenient reasons the order of operations should be different.
It's arbitrary.
Yeah, I don't understand.
But you're
what
creating, it's a logical system
saying.
that has to start somewhere.
Correct. So that is why. Well, so when you look on social media, and you see people making fun of average Joe not learning the order of operations, it's like, I understand why people don't. It's because when they were taught it, either they remember what they memorized or they don't remember what they memorized. But no one was
It was
taught.
taught as a
Why do
rule.
we?
Exactly.
It's math is simple.
Well, so
One
math.
plus one is two.
No, so math has certain things which are clear why they're that way, but then there's also a lot of rules that it's unclear. It's just, somebody created these rules and then the rules were accepted.
But like nobody would ever. Why would anybody ever calculate a million and a billion?
Well, so it's like if you have a calculator, a scientific calculator, you actually can program it using different rules. And then it just messes you up. And then, so what we're doing a lot of times is we take people and then we actually don't realize that we're scientifically injecting a belief system in science and in math and all these things.
Absolutely. You are.
Yeah, so anyways, that's I'm glad we got it. Okay, so let's learn a little bit about the Parsha. Yeah.
So you're basically saying that. How do you?
Vayera.
How long is this? You made a
As long as I
play.
want.
What?
As long as I want. Okay, let's go. So this week's Parsha is Vayera.
Yes,
So as we mentioned yesterday in the speech, Vayera is quite symbolic of God appearing to Avram. And there are different levels of godly revelation. Speaking and saying something, hearing God's voice is one. Vayera is a much greater one. So at the end of last week's Parsha, God, and there's quite a few Rashis on this actually, on this verse here. God commanded Avram to get a bris at age 99, and he got a bris. His son Yishmael got a bris at 13. Arabic cultures till today get their bris at 13, believe it or not. The Bnei Yishmael, they get their bris at 13 years old. We actually learned a talk last year from the Rebbe about the difference between Isaac and Yishmael arguing with each other, who's better, 13 or 8 days. And then Avram is sick. He's recovering, he's 99 years old, and he had a bris. So the first verse says, God appears to Avram, and Rashi says, Levaker es hachoila, to visit a sick person. There's a mitzvah visiting the sick people, right? So God is visiting him. Amar Rav Chaim bar Chanina. Rav Chaim bar Chanina says, Yom Shlishli lemilase haya. It was the third day of his circumcision. Obar Kadosh Baruch Hu v'shal b'shleimai. And God came and he visited him to see how he's doing. So that is the first Rashi. Now, let me just paraphrase. Now, this has to do with actually science, which is very interesting. This has to do with science. It's a very interesting perspective that the Rebbe has. Okay, now, he says, Be'elone Mamre. Mamre was somebody, he gave him advice to give a bris. He was sitting. So why was he sitting? He wanted to stand. God said, you sit, because you're recovering. And he was sitting at the door of his tent. Why was he sitting at the door of his tent? He really wanted guests. Avram loved having guests. It was a very hot day. God made it very hot. It says God took the sun out of its casing. The sun has actually in Kabbalah, we study about this a lot, but the sun has a lot more potential than we can see. And God limits the sun. If there would be too much light, we actually wouldn't be able to function. Everything would be white. So God took it out, so it was so hot, people wouldn't travel, and he wouldn't have guests. He could relax for a day. But Avram, nonetheless, was sitting by the door of his tent because he wanted guests. Now, that's the context of the beginning of the Parsha. So actually from here, the Midrash says, from here we see, it's greater to have guests. Gedoyel hachnasas orchim, bringing in guests, than kabbalos pnei hashchina, than receiving God's presence. That's greater. We learn that from here because despite the fact God is here, he wants guests. And who are these guests? These guests in the next verse, he picks his eyes, there's 3 guys standing there, and God sees that he really wants guests. 3 guys standing there, and these 3 guys are 3 angels, but he thinks they're Arabs. And we see that he says, has them wash off their feet because Arabs pray to the dust of their feet and in that time. And that's what Avram does. And then actually it turns out these 3 guys are angels. One of them came to heal Avram. One of them came to tell Sarah she's going to have baby Yitzchak. And then 2 of them went after. One of them went to save Lot, and one of them went to destroy Sodom. That's in later on in the Parsha.
So I want to ask a question.
Yeah.
So is it an inference at the beginning here that God made it hot so people wouldn't travel because he thought Abraham would prefer the guests to God? Is that what?
No, it's that Avram was healing. He thought Avram wouldn't
Okay,
want
so it was
guests.
just the healing.
He wouldn't want guests. And then Avram showed he wants guests. So that's so here's the big question that a lot of people ask on Rashi. Rashi says God was visiting him. It was the third day of circumcision. So the question is why did God, how does Rashi know that? Now in the Talmud it says different reasoning. One opinion says that the third day of circumcision is the most painful. But other opinions don't hold that. In fact, they say the third day is when the healing starts. So how is it that that Rashi knows that it's the third day of circumcision? Third day after. Maybe it's the first day. Why wouldn't God visit him on the first day, right? So the Rebbe has a very long technical talk on this. I'm not sure in this Chumash, it brings different explanations. But ultimately, what the Rebbe says is he says, how does Rashi know? Because the angel came on a third day. Now, we spoke last year when we were learning the Tzich, we spoke how, according to many opinions, the bris has to hurt. Ideally, the bris should hurt, and you shouldn't use any type of numbing substance. Now, practically speaking, if you're over one, we do use it nowadays because it's very painful. When a child is a baby, the nerve system is very, very new. So it actually, I asked the doctor and he said, it's about equivalent to what a paper cut feels like. It doesn't hurt that much. But when your nervous system gets stronger, it's quite painful. So, but there is an opinion in Jewish law that says, no, you have to feel the pain of the bris. It's part of the mitzvah of the bris. So the Rebbe basically goes into this whole thing and he explains, how does Rashi know it's the third day? Because an angel came to heal him that day. Now, so Avram had to be 2 days in pain, and then the third day the angel came to heal him. Why didn't the angel come earlier? Because healing of the bris, naturally, the healing starts on the third day. It starts healing a little bit on the third day. So the Rebbe says, well, an angel healing, that's supernatural. That's supernatural, right? If an angel comes on the third day, that's supernatural. So that's the opposite of a bris. Avram, the first bris, can't be supernatural. So the Rebbe says a very interesting thing, which I want to mention here because it has to do with science. He says, no, an angel coming to heal is natural. He said, really, medicines and healing comes through angels. We don't just heal naturally because our body heals, our immune system. Our immune system is run by spiritual energy. The difference between Avram and us is we say, hey, here, I'll take this Tylenol. Avram sees an angel. He can see what it really is. So when this angel came to heal him, it wasn't supernatural. An angel coming to heal, Malach Rafal, is the natural way of healing. Just our eyes don't have the ability to see the spiritual energy behind our natural healing.
He actually saw the angel.
So he actually saw the angel. We see the angels doing when we heal. We see the result, but we take for granted, like, oh yeah, when we look at like Tylenol, we're like, let's say, well, Tylenol does this and it thins the blood and whatever, et cetera, and that heals us. But really, it's like, why does Tylenol actually do that and not apples, let's say? Because there's spiritual energy which God programmed in the physical objects, which causes the physical objects to go and we react in a certain way. So based on that, the Rebbe says that it could be Rashi says it's the third day because the angel came. So God probably came the first and second day. But because the angel came that day and Avram's healing started that day, and the third day is when, you start healing for the bris, Rashi says in the Talmud. He said because of that, that's how Rashi knows it's the third day. So, what I look at is the opposite. When we look at like the sun and the moon and health or anything like that, the video, please stop, Mendel. The video of the Rebbe last night that came out was a video of the Rebbe talking about, amazing video of the Rebbe talking about Israel. They've been putting out these videos, very powerful videos, and their hope that like some politicians should see and people should know. So interestingly, the Rebbe there says that, he says Jewish people have to be proud and say it's our land, once and for all. So the Rebbe said, really, when we look at a war or when we look at security, we say, okay, never again, never again, right? We need to carry guns, let's say.
Well, this was Netanyahu said, this is our never again moment.
Well, so when we look at that, the Rebbe always was of the opinion that, let's say, it says we came into exile because we sinned. So if you want to stop exile, you might need guns and everything like that. But until you take away the original reason, you can't take away the symptom. So you need to have both. You have to go and fight and protect, but really your focus has to be inside. Well, we have to take away the reason of exile. We can't just protect, now that we're in exile, we have to protect ourselves. We also take away the reason of exile. We have to take away, do more mitzvahs and become better Jews. So here also, the Rebbe was pointing out, and here he's saying, when we get sick and we need healing, or whenever there's a problem, we need to fix it, there's always a deficit, and we need to fix the deficit. But really, if we can tap in the reason for the deficit, then we can have a greater healing. And that's also in layers in medicine also as well. In physical medicine, you have that in layers of healing,
But that deficit is spiritual then.
Well, ultimately, the deficit is spiritual. And Avram was able to see a physical manifestation because he could just see the spiritual in the physical. But we don't have the ability to see the spiritual and the physical. We only break it down into physical things. And that's why we, when we take medicine and everything like that, or when we do anything physical, we have to always try and see how can we help the situation spiritually as well. It's just developed from a talk of the Rebbe.
That's true.
Yeah. Do you want to do the first Balaturim? Yeah.
Balaturim?
Yaakov Balaturim, yeah. What's interesting is that Yaakov Balaturim.
I know. You caught me.
Just so when we say the Balaturim, what's so interesting about him is he has all these like mystical interpretations.